All right, and I'll just say welcome this evening. And I'll mention that as we go through tonight's presentation, there may be some trade names or brand names that you see mentioned in the presentation. Uh, just understand it's for clarity. It's not our intent to imply an endorsement of a product or in any way anything negative about a similar product that we don't mention. It's just a way for us to hopefully have greater clarity with what we're discussing. So I do want to mention there were a number of resources we pulled from for this evening's presentation. These were two that I found very useful, and these will be included in the email that is a follow-up tomorrow to you, so you don't have to worry about copying these down or remembering what they are. There'll also be several other resources, and I encourage you to take advantage of them, look at them, and I think you'll find some interesting things for further study on tonight's topic. So real quickly, just to begin, and it's because really, propagation isn't a word that probably most of us use all that often in just our general discourse during the day. Propagation, if we look at the actual definition of it, it's just the breeding of specimens of a plant or animal by natural processes from parent stock. In the case of plants especially, we're talking about both sexual as well as asexual methods that this is occurring. And so sexual propagation we're most likely familiar with plants when we think of seeds. So with seeds, you have that pollen transfer where we are getting that genetic transfer. And so the offspring are not genetic copies of either the plant that is providing the pollen nor the plant that's providing the ovule. It's actually a genetic mix of both. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, is reproduction without that exchange of genetics. And so what this means is offspring that result from asexual reproduction are actually genetic copies of the parent plant. We can think of them as clones. And so there are some good points to that. One of the things certainly is if we have characteristics that are unique about that plant, we're able to reproduce those. So we know what the plant's going to look like. It's not a question mark. Whenever we're doing sexual propagation, if you're just doing basically unlimited pollination where you're not controlling the parental lines, you have to grow out a large number of plants before you find those that would have characteristics you want. With asexual reproduction, it is a copy, so you're certainly knowing what that plant's going to look like once it matures. And it is also faster to maturity. So growing from seed is great. And of course, we take great advantage of that with a number of plants across the horticultural spectrum. But it is slower than growing from a cutting or from asexual propagation, particularly in those plants that have to reach maturity. So we think of things like fruit trees and things of that nature. Certainly you can grow an apple tree from seed, but it's much faster to use asexual propagation in the form of grafting to get a plant that reaches maturity and the bearing age for producing apples. It can be viewed negatively as well because it is a clone, because it is that genetic copy. We have less genetic diversity within that species then. So if we have some plants that maybe are difficult to produce through seed, typically we see that they have a very limited genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is beneficial because that's often how we come up with resistance to pests or different characteristics that may prove beneficial either to the plant itself or even to us as humans. So it may be aesthetic characteristics and diversity that we like. Another bad point with asexual propagation is depending on the method we're using, sometimes it's actually limited in the volume. So we may have fewer propagules, or that is to say, units that we can grow a plant from versus seed. If we think about many of the plants we grow, even in our vegetable gardens, one single seed can result in several hundredfold seed in the resultant fruit. And often with asexual reproduction, you don't have that multiplier factor there. You have fewer propagules to use. So Why would we want to propagate plants, or more specifically our house plants? Well, obviously it's not exactly rocket science to think we may want to make more of it. We may want to increase the number of plants that we have. One of the things that often happens with house plants is people give them as gifts, or they exchange them with other people to get plants they don't have. So certainly, that's a readily access to having more plants to share is a great opportunity. Another thing that sometimes becomes important is managing the size of a plant. So what you see on your screen there is a Pachypodium. I think if I'm remembering correctly, originally from Madagascar. And that there it is in like a 2 or 3 inch pot, just a small little funky looking plant. My mom had one of these. She grew it and it got over 7 feet tall. And certainly when they start getting larger, suddenly it becomes a challenge. Where do you put the thing? Oftentimes what we can do with propagating a plant, we can also control the size. So once it starts overgrowing the area that we have for it, we're able to manage that by propagating it and starting over with a smaller plant. So it can become very important when we're talking about limited spaces. Another thing that we can do with propagation is maintain the juvenility of a plant. So probably one of the best examples we can think about this is if you've ever grown just the common herb sage. If you've grown it for several years, because it can be a perennial in our area, it can overwinter. You may have noticed that as it gets older, it starts getting more woody on those older stems. And those older stems don't give you as much leaves. That is what we use as the herb. So we can actually be propagating that plant, so we always have a juvenile or a young plant with new growth, and we can actually get greater production out of it for our use. So maintaining the juvenility of a plant is another reason we can propagate plants. And there are many types of asexual reproduction. Again, I've mentioned already grafting. Tissue culture is one that we may not think about a lot, but particularly if you currently own an orchid, it's likely you're able to afford it because of tissue culture. Once upon a time, before tissue culture, orchids were very expensive. They weren't easily propagated, but with the advent of tissue culture, which is done in a laboratory, they're able to actually produce those at a much lower cost. And so that's now why we can go into the grocery store and find lovely orchids at a very reasonable cost. Cuttings we'll talk about extensively this evening. Plant division we'll also mention. Bulb replication. So if you're growing bulbs, there's actually methods that you can use to replicate those so you have more of them quicker. We won't go into detail of that tonight, but in some of the resources you can find further information of that. I think it's important to understand that asexual reproduction works because some plant cells are totipotent. Now that's a big word. And so what does totipotent or totipotency mean? What it means is those cells are able, with the proper conditions, which is both environmental as well as the presence of hormones, they're able to become any part of a plant that that plant needs. And so we take advantage of those totipotent cells and are actually able to then have a cutting that grows roots where it ordinarily might not. And so we can think of this sort of, if you're familiar, where people have talked about stem cells with humans, it's sort of analogous to that, in as much as those cells have the capacity with the right influences or directions to become other tissues. I do want to mention that with each individual plant, not every propagation method will work well for every species. So some may not do well from leaf cuttings, while others, that may be the primary way to have a successful propagation. So just understand we do want to double check and kind of cross-reference and say, okay, what's the most logical or the best way to approach the propagation of a particular plant? But you'll find that many of the plants that are easy to propagate, we can actually use a number of different methods to do so. I would tell you that if you're wanting to propagate houseplants, you should expect success. So it's true that when we look at asexual reproduction across the realm of horticulture, We can find, a lot of specialized equipment required. So when we look in commercial operations, there'll be things like mist beds, they use bottom heat and other strategies, but those are more likely to be used with woody plant materials and things like that that don't reproduce quite readily through asexual propagation. Most house plants are very easy to propagate, and it doesn't take any sort of specialized equipment or tactics. It just takes a little bit of knowledge, which hopefully you'll walk away with tonight. So I would encourage you to give it a try if you haven't before, and I would say most likely you will be successful. And I don't think that's by chance. I think that the most popular house plants are popular in part because they're easy to propagate. So it is one of those things where if they're very difficult to propagate, chances are they're not as popular because they're going to be more expensive. They're not as likely to be passed down through families or among friends. So it's kind of the nature that our popular houseplants just so happen to be easy to propagate. So we'll talk a little bit about some botany stuff here, and it's not something we're going to go in depth with because quite honestly, you just have to know a few basics to be able to take advantage of the natural processes that the plant has. So the big thing we want to walk away with are what are nodes. So nodes are points of origin or growing points on a plant. So they're where we have leaves or buds or stems growing from. And so here's a kalanchoe. Some people pronounce it calancho. You hear it both ways. I'm okay with either one. I always caution people that with my Appalachian American heritage, if it's a Latin word, chances are I'm pronouncing it wrong. So if you ever hear me pronounce a Latin word and you think, oh, I didn't realize that was the pronunciation, probably isn't the pronunciation. It's just the one I came up with. So with that out of the way, if you look up in the zoom in the right-hand corner, you'll see a node. And what we actually have are aerial roots growing as well as the original leaf. And then you can also see that there's actually a small stem starting. So if we look right here in this area there, you will actually see where we have all three of those things happening there. And that relates back to what is a node. It's that growing point. And so it's what's allowing those multiple types of tissues to form in that node area. And so what we do is we take advantage of this. And because those nodes have the ability to grow additional types of tissues rather than just a leaf, that's how we allow propagation to happen. So again, and you can see here, this is naturally occurring phenomena. This was a kalanchoe that I just had in a box with some other succulents, and you can see it started overgrowing the box, and it's throwing out those adventitious roots, those aerial roots. And we'll talk about more on those a little bit further too. So here's another example of nodes for you. This is actually just a small jade plant. The nodes are marked in red. Again, those growing points where we see leaves and buds and stems growing from. The blue areas are the internode space. And so as you read through some of the supplemental materials, you may see things referring to the internode space, and all it is the space between nodes. So typically when we come in to do cuttings for propagation, we'll be cutting in that internode space because again, we don't want to damage the node itself. So we cut the internode spacing. Internodes can sometimes be indicative if we see very large distances. That can be a plant that maybe isn't receiving as much light as it would want ordinarily, but that is very species specific. Some plants have longer or larger internode spaces than others, so it's not really something we can compare relative to another plant, but within a given species, it can be indicative of whether plants are receiving enough light. We also see there in the smaller picture, we actually see aerial roots forming on a jade tree. Again, opposite of a leaf that was attached. What happened there probably was because jades do form pairs of leaves, the one leaf got knocked off. And as part of the wound response, the plant actually decided to grow aerial roots. It really didn't do the plant any good, but that was just the natural response that the plant took. And again, I want to stress that the reason this works, the reason we focus on these nodes is at those nodes are where those totipotent cells or those cells that can be turned into different types of plant tissues are originating from. So those are the focus of our propagation work. So again, this is kind of like the heavy part of the botany stuff. We want to make sure we understand where nodes are located at on the plant, because that's where we're going to have, for instance, if we're rooting cuttings, where we're going to have cuttings to originate their roots from. So nodes are important to understand where they're at on a plant. Very often they're very obvious, and on many of our house plants, they start forming aerial roots without any sort of promotion on our part, so it's very easy to find these. So adventitious roots, I said this earlier, and all an adventitious root is where we have roots growing from a part of the plant other than the root system. So where we have things creating aerial roots. We see this with a number of plants, not just house plants. You'll actually see a corn plant there in the upper right-hand corner. If you've ever grown sweet corn or even field corn in a garden scenario, you'll see they have what's referred to as prop roots. Those are aerial roots that we actually see arising from stems from a node that anchor the plant into the ground better. And so it's common with many plants. Some of our pest plants, so if you've ever grown bamboo, for instance, you know that it can overgrow where you want it to grow. That's because they form a type of adventitious roots called rhizomes. We also find rhizomes with things such as Johnson grass or Bermuda grass, which certainly can be weeds in their own respect, depending where they're at, but even bearded iris that we grow in the garden will also form rhizomes. So adventitious roots to spread or to self-propagate by the plant is something that occurs naturally, and we just try to take advantage of that when we're propagating plants. On the other hand, we have adventitious shoots. And as you would guess, adventitious shoots are where we have buds or shoots that are growing from material that are not at the apex of the plant or at the leaf axial, where the leaf axial is basically the node. It's another way to refer to the node. It's just where the leaves are originating from. And so if we have shoots arising from something other than that sort of tissue, then we're looking at adventitious shoots. An excellent example of adventitious shoots are when we are growing sprouts for planting from sweet potatoes. We actually have a root there that we are growing shoots from. And again, because it's not the apex bud of the plant, nor is it the leaf axial, those are truly adventitious shoots. Sometimes you'll see, people refer to these as dormant buds. So if you cut down a tree and you leave a stump and you see the stump regrowing with shoots, that's another instance of adventitious shoots. They're growing from buds that were dormant because they were receiving hormones from plant buds higher up. A lot of the botany behind this, if you really want to dig into it, is looking at the distribution of hormones within the plant. And so, for instance, whenever we pinch back herbs to get them to grow more bushy, or we hedge things back to get them to grow more bushy, what we're literally doing is affecting the distribution of hormones within those plants. And so we just look at it as pruning, but we're actually changing the distribution of hormones. And what happens, that allows some of these dormant buds to form adventitious shoots that ordinarily would not have grown because of hormones they were receiving because of other buds that were growing. So that's just a little background on that. But again, you don't have to know a lot of specifics on that. It's just something to have a little bit better understanding of the mechanics of what's happening. When we're talking about asexual reproduction, probably the two most useful methods for houseplants are just cuttings, and this is where we have a propagule. And a propagule is just to say the portion of a plant that we're using to reproduce it. So it could be that there's multiple forms of cuttings, and we'll go through several of them this evening. So a propagule is just a generic term to say what we're using to propagate the plant. So with a cutting, the propagule doesn't have roots to begin with on its own. So it has to first grow roots to replenish nutrients and water. Layering is when we have a propagule that's still attached to a mother plant, and so it's maintaining its access and source of nutrients and water during the propagation process. So with cuttings, we need to quickly get them rooted and get them growing in a good media that has good nutrition for them, because they are completely on their own. They're self-contained. Layering, on the other hand, it can be a slower process. We're not as worried about the speed it happens, because it's getting its nutrition and its water from that parent plant that's already growing well. Now, there's even an easier route if we're talking about propagating plants, and we can refer to this as division. So we talked about rhizomes. Well, similar to rhizomes are stolons, in as much as like spider plants will produce stolons, which are runners. You'll hear people often refer to them as runners, and they grow a little plantlet on the end. And if we allow those to grow and mature, you don't just get a little plant, you actually get a plant with roots. It's a self-contained little plant that you can immediately pot up, and it can be happy as a lark and growing really quickly. The reason it's able to develop both the leaves as well as those roots is because it's still attached to that mother plant. Likewise with things such as the Sansevieria of different types, the mother-in-law's tongues, if you will, they produce offsets. And so these are small little plants that grow up from the root system of the original mother plant. You can see that in the middle picture there depicted. So you allow that to get a little bit bigger, get a little size on it, and then you sever it, you divide it from the mother plant, and you have a new plant ready to go that's already got both leaves and roots. And then there are some plants like some of the kalanchoes that are just reproducing all on their own without your help. They form actual little plantlets along their leaf edges. Depending how long they stay on that leaf, you'll actually see roots growing from them. They can get fairly decent in size. These are super simple. Basically, you just sprinkle them in a pot, they'll root down on their own and start growing. That's also one thing about them that's a little bit negative. If you have these plants, which I have several of them, I like them. I think they're a really interesting plant. But the challenge is you end up with all these little plants growing in all your pots. So it actually can be a little bit of a nuisance if you have plants like this. But certainly there are some plants to where we don't have to take any action. Just as we grow them over time, we will see that they propagate themselves. And so really, whenever we're looking at some of the other plants, we're just kind of mimicking the situation as much as we can to get the same things to happen. So there are some plants that you may be growing as house plants that quite literally all you have to do is take advantage of what they're naturally doing. And so that makes it great. But what's also great is even those that we have to put a little effort for, it's still very easy. So what plants are we looking to propagate? First off, we want to make sure that we have pest-free plants. If something is sick, if it's infested with insects, we need to take care of that first. We need to deal with disease and insects before we propagate it, because we can pass those on to the propagated plant. And so we don't want to be multiplying our trouble along with the plant. The other thing to be aware of is there are plants that are patented. So you will typically see on the label with the plant, it may mention a PVP or PP number, things like that. There are some plants that are patented. The vast majority of most houseplants are not. Where we run into some that could be are some of the ones that we may buy out of like the florist section. So there are some kalanchoes that are actually patented. It's not the usual fare, but there are some that could be. And again, just be aware of that. Quite honestly, it's technically illegal even for you personally to propagate a patented plant for your own use. Realistically, I doubt anybody's ever going to know. So they're more concerned with people that are illegally propagating these and selling them on the open market, not someone who wants a second plant to put in the family living room or something. But again, do pay attention to this. What's good about it, these patents reward those that are developing and breeding plants. So we do want to follow it, of course, because it's a great way to encourage more development with these plants and new varieties being brought to market. Generally speaking, when we're talking about propagating, newer growth is more likely to more easily grow roots. So again, some of this has to do with juvenility versus maturity. With most of our houseplants, it's not a big deal, but typically newer will root more easily. So when we think about cuttings, we don't necessarily want to take the oldest part of a plant and try to grow from that. Typically, newer or midlife growth is a better choice. While we're doing our cuttings, we don't need intense light. In fact, intense light is a negative because, again, remember, most of these cuttings, unless we're talking about layering, but when we're talking about cuttings, they don't have a root system. And the more white light we give those plants, the more moisture they're going to lose through transpiration. And so that means the less they're going to have to grow the roots that we're looking for. So again, don't place these propagules in direct sunlight. They can be in a bright area, but they don't need to be in direct sunlight. If you have them under grow lamps or something like that, certainly make sure it's not too intense. Have some distance between them. Another thing to be aware of, cutting orientation is important. So make sure things are the right side up, because there are literally some things that if we take a leaf cutting, for instance, and turn it upside down, it will not root. Gravity is important to success, and it does have to do somewhat with hormones. So make sure that you are keeping a cutting in its proper orientation, where up is still up after we make the cutting. And I'll show some examples of that to demonstrate it further. One thing that is generally a good idea with most cuttings in the horticultural world is to allow for a cutting to have a wound response before we place it in propagation. The technical term for it is suberization, and what it allows for is callus formation. So callus is undifferentiated cells or tissue. So those are those cells that, depending on what hormone and environmental factors come to play, will develop into shoots or roots, as the case may be. When we talk about tissue culture, what they literally do is they create callus within the laboratory, and then from that they apply hormones to start growing plants. Quite honestly, for easily propagated plants, which would basically be most all house plants, we don't really have to take this step. It's not a necessity, but it is something maybe to be aware of. If you're reading through some of the resources, you may find some references to suberization or allowing a wound response. And that's why it's there. And again, for some of the more woody type materials in the landscape, certainly this is very much advisable. For most of these house plants, you're going to have success without taking this extra step. We don't really have to do anything special to prepare a plant for propagation. The one thing I would mention is, again, it goes back to we're removing a cutting from its source of water. So we want to make sure that the plant is properly hydrated. So we'd want a day or two prior to water the plant as we normally would. We don't have to give it extra water. We're not trying to drown the plant. All we want to do is make sure that the plant is able to take up the expected normal amount of water that it would, so it's fully hydrated whenever we take that cutting. Sometimes we can think of propagating a plant that maybe is sick or is having problems. One of the challenges with that is if it doesn't have the resources to do a good job growing where it's at, there's also consideration that it's not going to be able to do a good job in the propagation challenge as well. So we do like to make sure those plants are properly hydrated whenever we take cuttings. Rooting hormone is another thing that for our easy to propagate plants basically is not an issue. Certainly, and again, this goes back to hormones help control what happens with those totipotent cells. And so there's a multitude of companies out there with these products. They're basically all the same thing. They're an IBA product, which is a hormone. Some of them will have fungicide in them, some of them will not. And certainly if you want to use these even on easy to root houseplants, there's nothing wrong with that. Only caution I would offer is never dip your cutting into the original container. So we always want to pour some out into a disposable cup, paper plate, something like that, so we're not contaminating that bulk material. We do want to dip the cutting into it soon after we have taken the cutting, because we actually do want a fresh wound there, so it can take up the hormone quite readily. And whenever we plant the cutting that we have treated with the rooting powder, we actually want to use what is technically a dibble to place it into that media that we're using. And typically we would be placing this into some sort of media and water. Of course, you might ask, what in the world is a dibble? So really a dibble is a very old tool. You can think of it kind of as a planting stick. And so they come in many forms. They can be T-shaped sometimes. Modern ones are often with a metal point, but all it does, it makes a hole within the soil or media for a plant propagule, whether we're talking about seeds or bulbs or cuttings. The reason we use it when we use the hormone is we don't want to scrape off all the rooting hormone powder from the end of the cutting when we stick it into the media. So we actually make a hole with something else. Generally speaking, when we're talking about cutting, something like a pencil or a dowel or even a small stick works excellently. You don't have to go out and buy a dibble. Dibbles are very old tools. I actually, I ran across an interesting snippet out of a 1764 published garden dictionary. And what's interesting to me is it talking about using a dibble to make the holes for planting tulip bulbs. What's interesting, it's talking about that when you have clay soils, it's actually not a good method because of the pressure, you basically solidify the sides and bottoms of the hole, and that prevents roots from moving out into the larger soil, as well as can hold water in that hole itself. What's interesting, we have the same problem today with planting in the landscape when people use augers for planting either plants or bulbs. It all has to do with the pressure being applied, and particularly when we have significant amounts of clay in the soil. So I just found it odd that, you know, from the 1760s, we have an issue with proper planting methods and maybe trying to use a tool to take a shortcut. And we still have it today, albeit maybe with a different tool. So I just found that interesting. So if we take a cutting, and we'll talk more about the types of cuttings we can take, but what do we do with that cutting once we take it? Well, we need to put it in some sort of media for propagation. And really, there's a list of different ones you see there on your screen. Those that you most likely see in most examples and references for houseplants are either water, vermiculite, perlite, and sometimes just potting media, just potting soil. We call it media because truly there's no soil in it. And any of those work well. The one thing we do want to mention is that the roots that form in water are different than those that form in the others, because roots can form different types of tissues, and where water doesn't have oxygen in it, they are a little bit different than those that would form in these other medias. One thing we want to stress with all of them except the potting media is that once the roots are formed, we want them to pot them up into the appropriate media for the plant. So for instance, for succulents, we want something very free draining. Even if we started it from a cutting in water, we want it to go to the appropriate type of media. The reason we want to do that is none of those, besides potting media, the last one on the bottom, have any significant amount of nutrients that the plant needs. They're just there for their structural purposes, their physical characteristics that allow for good rooting. And certainly any of them can be used. There's nothing wrong with using sand or bark. It certainly can be done. But again, water, vermiculite, perlite, or potting media are those most often used. And we'll talk about some of that. I've already mentioned this, so just real quick. Roots formed in water are different than other roots, so make sure that you do pot those up soon. That being said, particularly if you're working with youth or you're wanting to demonstrate cutting as well, growing things in water where it can actually be seen, and even where you know, a round container of water has that magnification effect to it, it can really be visually interesting. So there's a lot of reasons to do water propagation. Currently on the marketplace, there are all kinds of sort of home decor items that function as water propagators because it can be visually appealing for sure. So again, nothing wrong with it. I've rooted many things in water over the year and they do pot up well. So it's certainly not something to dissuade you from it. Just understand the limitations of it. One thing that's really interesting is there's actually a great way to create a propagation pot that's really a relatively old method. And so it actually goes back to 1835, and it's commonly referred to as the Forsyth pot. And it was created or developed by Alexander Forsyth. And basically what it is you have two pots. The inner pot must be an unglazed terracotta pot, and the larger pot you fill with vermiculite. What I find interesting is this is actually a snippet out of the 1835 issue of the Gardener's Magazine. And in it, he talks about putting a layer of broken pot or gravel in the bottom of the large pot for drainage. Well, if you were with us on some of our earlier webinars, you know, of course, now research shows that doesn't actually improve drainage. All you do is raise the water table and reduce the volume of the pot. But you can see that sort of myth goes back a long distance, and it's something that still pops up every now and then. But basically, you fill the smaller pot with water, you fill the larger pot with vermiculite. And because that clay pot is porous, you have the water going into the vermiculite at a predictable rate. The language that Forsyth actually uses is the regularity of the supply of moisture without any chance of saturation, the power of examining the state of the cuttings at any time without injuring them by lifting out the inner pot, the superior drainage so essential in propagation by having such a thin layer of soil, the roots being placed by the sides of both pots. Basically, I think it's a little long-winded, but it's a great method. You don't stay too wet. You don't stay too dry. As long as you maintain the water reservoir with water in it, that clay pot, you have even moisture, which is what you need for rooting plants. And you can easily pull out the cuttings. You can easily take, again, a pencil or a bamboo skewer, help pull those out. You could actually remove that inner pot like he suggests and look at the development. And so it works really well. And it is something that readily is adaptable to modern materials. We would use probably vermiculite would be our first choice. I think his original design was using sand, but vermiculite works very well. This is actually from a University of Minnesota presentation, and you'll have references and a link to this in your email tomorrow. And so you can see there, they've actually stopped the hole up of the clay pot with just a cork. You can use any number of different materials to do that. And then you can put a number of different cuttings in there, even different type of cuttings. I will reference in that bottom right-hand picture, you see the snake plant there. That's one where you can take multiple cuttings from a single blade or a single leaf. And if you get those turned upside down, they won't be successful with rooting. So that's one plant that I mentioned earlier. Orientation is very important. You get that turned upside down and you won't be successful. So be careful if you take multiple cuttings from a single leaf that you do maintain that proper orientation. But a Forsyth pot works great. It's not expensive. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge finding vermiculite. It's not always readily available in like big box stores, for instance, but it is worth a little bit of effort. I think vermiculite does work better than sand or even perlite or something like that. Humidity is often important with many species. Again, in my experience, most of our house plants is not critical. So it's very easy to accomplish this. You can actually take, for instance, a Forsyth pot, put it in a bag, and you do want to prevent that plastic bag from contacting the leaves that might be there. So either putting some bamboo skewers, some wires, or actually another method is to actually inflate the bag before you close it around the pot. And so you actually have like a balloon there. You'd want to check it probably every week and make sure that the media is staying as moist as it should. You can also do the same principle with flats and using plastic over it. If you have seed starting little setups that have the plastic domes, you can take a plastic shoebox, use that to hold humidity. So actually put cuttings into a plastic shoebox that has appropriate media in it. stick your cuttings in there, put the lid on it. Again, we're not worried about having high transmission of light. These plants can't utilize light yet because they don't have the roots to pull up the water and nutrients that's needed for all the photosynthetic processes. So we're okay if we're not getting huge light transmission to these. And certainly we can make things look a little bit nicer. If you have a bell jar or a cloche, something like that out of glass, certainly you can utilize that. But again, in general terms, with most houseplants, this is not a critical step, which is good. It means it's much easier for us. But certainly if you have plants where you're taking cuttings, you're trying to root them, and you see significant damage or loss of the leaves, that's where you might switch and say, okay, this is one I'm going to have to provide a higher level of humidity, and there are some very simple ways to accomplish that. We'll talk a minute about leaf cuttings because they come in a variety of forms, but essentially they're all very similar. So we can take a leaf petiole cutting, which is where we leave the petiole attached. It works for any number of plants. Those you see listed on the screen are not in any way, shape, or form an exhaustive list of all that it would work for. They're just a good sample of some, but you can see it's very relatively straightforward. We actually leave the petiole attached to the leaf, and we would place that into the rooting media. We can also do leaves without petioles. This again is a great example of what happens with a snake plant. And what happens, and you might think, well, why on earth would anybody get confused about the orientation, what's up or what's down? Snake plant is a great example of this because it's more narrow at either end than it is in the middle. So if you think about, well, if it was truncated, starts big, goes small, it would be easy to figure out which end is up and which end is down. But it's not. We actually have the widest margin of the leaf, the widest portion in the middle. So sometimes it can be deceptive. You can actually be putting a cutting in where the bottom portion is smaller rather than the top. And so that can sometimes be confusing. So pay attention to that orientation again. But again, we can also do cuttings of African violet leaves without the petiole. We can do some cuttings of begonias this way as well. A number of different plants. So again, not an exhaustive list on your screen. Begonias are also one where we can do a fairly unique type of leaf cutting with them. It's called a split vein. And so what you do is on the underside of the leaf, you would slice through the major veins. And then you would remove the petiole, or you already removed the petiole, and you place that leaf flat firmly against the surface of the rooting media. And you can actually see in the upper picture where they're actually pinning it down. So you can pin it down, you can place some media along the edges of the leaf, because what is, you're wanting to make sure there's good contact between those cut veins and the potting media or the propagation media if you're using a vermiculite, perlite, something like that. This works very well with the rhizomaceous type of begonias, so Rex begonias, as well as the beefsteak begonia, if you're familiar with that, can be propagated this way. Things like angel wing begonias would not be as easily propagated this way, and we typically would not do this with. So split vein is one that's kind of unique. Leaf bud cuttings are where we actually kind of remove a leaf bud out from the plant and we leave attached some of the stem tissue. So it's technically still a leaf cutting, but we're also removing some of that stem tissue. There's a number of plants that we can use this with. You see those listed on the screen. And again, what you'll find too is a lot of these cuttings, you can use different cuttings or multiple types of cuttings for the same plant. So don't think there's only one proper way. For the majority of our plants, we can use multiple methods. So you don't feel locked into only a single kind. And you may be seeing some of the same plants pop up for these different type of cuttings. Cane cuttings are for plants that readily produce adventitious shoots and roots from their stems. We see things like dumb cane, corn plant, Chinese evergreen. You actually take a cutting of the stem and place it horizontally, partially buried in the rooting media. And it will grow a new plant. Some of the things like dumb cane, you can actually quite readily see some little bumps on the stem where there are those adventitious buds that naturally form on the plant anyway. So sometimes it's not a surprise that we can see why this would work well. I will caution you that with dumb cane, another name for that is Dieffenbachia. That's the Latin name. It does have a sap that can be an irritant. So make sure if you are taking cuttings of that, you don't get it into your eyes. Ideally, you probably wouldn't want to get it onto your skin either, but it can be something to be aware of. So be careful if you are propagating that plant. So one of the most common cutting types we take is called a tip cutting. And so the top picture there, that's a golden pothos plant. And where we have the red marks, basically we just cut off the end of the runner or the stem, whatever you want to call it. Pothos is a vining plant, so you can kind of think of it as a runner. You can see that it's already naturally trying to produce roots on its own. This is one that roots very readily, so we can take that cutting, cut it there in the internode space, and then remove that one leaf and bury that node that we removed the leaf from underneath the soil. It will very readily root. Again, you can see that root already starting there even without being propagated, and it works great. We can see a similar format to this to more of a plant that has a more stem growth to it. That's a angel wing begonia. You can just, that actually was a branch of a plant of mine that actually knocked off by mistake. You can actually just take that, throw it in some water, throw it in some good rooting media, even good potting soil, keep it moist, and it will very readily grow roots from the nodes. So again, these are tip cuttings. What's good about tip cuttings is typically where you leave some existing leaves on there and you have that natural growing bud still intact. They grow pretty quickly and they establish well. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always the choice we want to make. We can also, with that same pothos plant, do multiple cuttings. So if we were to make 3 cuttings out of that stem, the furthest left could still be referred to as a tip cutting because it is the tip of the plant. But those other 2, we would leave the leaves intact in this instance and just bury those nodes. And so we might want to do this if we're wanting to fill out a pot quicker. Where a single cutting may be larger, it's not going to bush out as quickly. So quite often when you look at more running sort of hanging basket plants, you'll notice that they have multiple plants in that container, not just a single plant. The reason they do that is having multiples in there allow it to fill out quicker. And so this is why you may take multiple cuttings rather than leave one large cutting. So certainly you could take 3 cuttings out of this and have 3 little propagules to root and pot up. And so each cutting still has that node attached. We're making our cuts in the internode space, and we can have just as much success as if we were doing a tip cutting. Air layering is something that we do with plants. Typically, they're a little more difficult to propagate. What we actually do is, again, layering, we're talking about leaving the plant attached to the mother plant. So, you can do this with many different plants in the horticulture world. So any of our brambles, blackberries, raspberries, things of that nature. In fact, this is one reason why we can have like blackberry thickets and things of that nature is layering effect where when those canes are bent over and come in contact with the ground, they root. And so, then we start growing another plant. So you get these impenetrable masses of berries. That's how it happens. Well, air laying is kind of the same idea, except rather than bending the plant down to a pot of soil or to the soil, which we can do, we're actually leaving it upright on the plant. So what you do is you wound the plant. You see one there where we removed a circle of the bark, the other one where we've made the cut up into the bark. Depending on the type of plant, not all of them will work with the circular, the collar wound. Some of them, it all depends how they have their xylem and phloem arranged. So you want to make sure you're using the right type of cut for that. But for instance, where we do the upward cut to have the slit, we have to make sure that that stays open. So we would actually either stick a piece of toothpick under there or make sure that with the next step where we apply sphagnum moss, we make sure we jam it up in there, because what we want is we don't want that wound to close back because the plant can just heal it. It can be almost like a graft then. It will heal itself. We don't want that. We have to have that wound response so we can get growth of roots. So we want to make sure that wound stays open. So basically you wound the stem, you keep it open, You do want to apply rooting hormone typically in this scenario, and then you cover it well with damp sphagnum moss. You then cover that with plastic, secure it well. You're going to check the progress on it probably every week or 2 weeks, make sure it's remaining moist. And then when it is well rooted in there and it'll become obvious, you'll see it, then you can just prune it off that mother plant. So this is one that's really good if you have something like a rubber plant or something like that that's growing too large. You can do this on one of the stems, get another small plant, and then either find a new home for the rubber plant or even toss it, because you're able just to keep reproducing the plant and able to have something that's a manageable size. So air layer is something that it's a little bit slower than some of the other cutting methods, highly effective, and it can work well with things that are a little more difficult to root because it's staying attached to that mother plant. It's getting water, it's getting nutrients. And so that helps us to have more success. So one thing I want to mention, there are some plants for which they are variegated. If we take cuttings and propagate them, we will lose that variegation. And so basically what it comes down to is what causes the variegation. So within some plants, variegation is caused by what's called a chimera. And basically you have different layers of cells, and with a chimera, some of those essentially are almost like albino. They're without chlorophyll. And what happens is, depending where that plantlet originates from, what layer of cells, if it's a chimera, then that new plantlet is not going to inherit or have that genetic copy of that chimera. And so what it is, it reverts back to the non-variegated form of the plant. And snake plant is one of those that's the case for. So that variegated snake plant, if it is one of the chimeras, which I believe it is, I believe all the variegated snake plants are, you would have a successful plant grow there, but it's just going to be the green mottled one. It's not going to have those yellowish edges to it that make it such a stunner. So just understand that with chimera variegated plants, you would have to use like offsets to propagate them. Doing propagation where we're relying on adventitious buds like leaf cuttings and things like that isn't going to be successful. So just be aware that some plants you can lose variegation. One of the resources I'm going to provide you in the email is one of the ones I showed earlier, the University of Nebraska publication. I really liked it. I thought they had a good, succinct and concise summary of propagation methods that they suggest for different common house plants. Certainly it doesn't cover every house plant on there, and you can see for a number of them we see different methods that you can actually do to accomplish propagation. So it does go back to some of these are so easy to propagate, there's multiple methods, while others maybe take a little bit more specialized effort to have success. So certainly that's an excellent resource I think you'll find useful. There's my contact info. Let me encourage you, if you run into a problem or you have an issue, if there's something you're wanting to propagate. Certainly I didn't cover every possible houseplant this evening, and the publications may miss some. You can find a lot of information about propagation out there on the internet. Some of it is a little bit wonky or suspect maybe, but quite honestly there's a lot of good resources even from private individuals. There's some excellent resources out there, videos and things of that nature that can help lead you on how to propagate this. So it's certainly not something that you have to ask me about, but I'm always happy to talk about plants. So if you have any questions related to plant propagation and things of that nature, I'm very happy to do that. Please contact me at your convenience. I always do think that this is a topic that's best taught in person, because I think it's a much easier to get an understanding of nodes and things of that nature when we can handle plant material and really look at it. But hopefully this evening I at least introduced you to some things you maybe didn't know. The one thing I do want to say, I want to encourage you to try it. Houseplants by and large are easy to propagate. So I want to encourage you to give it a try and see if you can have some success with it. You'll have some failures, and that's okay too. So just give it a try, and I think you'll have more success than failures.